Hello and welcome to lecture number 11 of ITEC4017, Photo and Non-Photorealistic Rendering. I'm your instructor as always, Leslie Eisted, and in today's lecture we are finally getting to that super fun topic known as painterly rendering. And it's a topic that I really hope you're all going to enjoy because I know it is certainly one of my favorites. So let's just briefly talk about our announcements before we get into the topic. So first off, note that assignment 5 has now been posted. And also note that you're going to have to download and install some software onto your computer in order to do this. I've posted the links that you will need. If you run into any issues with the installation of the tool, please let me know. I have tested it though, and it does seem to work pretty easily. So you shouldn't have any issues, but if you do, please let me know. And hopefully you'll have fun with that assignment. The other thing I want to remind you of is your final project is also posted, and that the rendering for that project is going to take quite a while. So my recommendation to you is to get started early so that you can get the rendering underway as soon as possible. And keeping in mind that the first two parts of the final project are asking you to create photorealistic scenes. We're really trying to ask you to create an image that looks as close to a photo as possible, which is why it's going to take a while to render. All right. So, today I want to talk about painterly rendering, which, as I just mentioned, is one of my favorite topics. But let's dive in a bit as to what we mean. So, as I'm sure many of you are quite familiar, there are many different art styles out there. Now, so far we've talked about some non-photorealistic art styles for our rendering, things like toon shading, pen and ink drawing, rendering edges and hatches, doing stippled drawings, but there's way more than just these few simple styles. In fact, most styles of art that we're generally thinking of are some form of painting. And there's different ways we can consider the kind of painting. We could consider oil painting or acrylic painting, tempera paints, mixed media painting, watercolors. So those are one way that we could think of various paintings. But we could also think of painting in terms of different art styles or different eras of art styles. So things like Impressionism and Expressionism, Fauvism and Pointillism. There are many different movements that have made their way through the arts, and they each have some very unique properties to them that would separate and identify them from each other. So for example, this is one of Claude Monet's paintings that was done sometime between 1915 and 1926. This is from his rather famous series, The Water Lilies. And as I said, this is an Impressionist painting. What we can observe in this particular painting is that it's somewhat abstract in the sense that we don't see the details of the lilies finely painted. We don't see individual petals. We don't see the big water lily pads. It gives us the impression of the water lilies without the fine details. And one of the interesting things about Monet's paintings is the absence of the color black. In shadows where we would typically use a shade of gray to render them, he's instead replacing it with darker tones of blues, greens, browns to try to capture how the light is interacting with the world. It's one of those things he was well known for. This painting here is by Seurat. It was done in 1884, and it's called A Sunday on La Grande Jatte. And this painting is fairly famous, and I'm sure many of you have also seen this one as well. This is a pointillist painting, and if you look very closely at the strokes that were used in this particular painting, you'll see that they're very fine. We see no long painted strokes or short brush strokes. It's kind of like it's stippled because it's a pointillist. It's done with many fine points. And although the brush used was a fine point, there's a certain abstraction to the details of the objects in the scene. Very smooth edges, which is very neat. Not a lot of detail in the face, although a surprising amount of detail in this woman's ear and this man's ear. Now here's a painting I'm sure you've all seen before. This is Starry Night by Van Gogh. It's from 1889. And if we were to characterize the strokes that you see in this particular painting, we see a lot of shades of blue, and we see the strokes are a bit longer, medium length, somewhat curved and following the direction of the motion or the direction of the light. Very, very famous painting, of course. And many of you have probably seen this painting as well. This is La Danse by Matisse in 1909. And this is another very interesting painting in the sense that in the previous paintings, the brush strokes were all very, very visible throughout the whole painting. So Monet's very short strokes, Seurat's pointed strokes, Van Gogh's longer strokes. But now the main areas of color, we can almost see no strokes at all. And the only strokes, in fact, we do see are those that are outlining the dancing people in the image. And here's another one. So these ones before, these are all representing various art movements, but also these are all oil paintings. And this one here, however, is not an oil painting. And you can see that from this, it's a watercolor. It's actually a self-portrait by Paul Cézanne. And the medium here is dictating the kinds of strokes. So you don't generally see paint strokes with watercolors, but they do leave a rather unique appearance on the paper. So when we're talking about painterly rendering, we are talking about the ideas of capturing the look and feel of the media and the look and feel of the particular style in whatever algorithm we're trying to use to recreate a certain look. But to do that, we need to ask ourselves what actually gives all of those paintings their different visual qualities. And we've talked about some of them just briefly here, things like the stroke length for the paint brushes, the orientation of the strokes, and whether they're how long they are, how wide they are. Is there a variety of different stroke sizes? We're also looking at things like the accuracy of the depiction. What do we mean by that? Well, if you look at Monet's water lilies, it's not very accurate. We see, as I mentioned, there's no petals. There's no actual lily pads. We don't see, you can kind of see where the reflection on the water would be, but it's not very clearly rendered, which tells us that this is not a very accurately depicted painting. Whereas this pointillist painting, even though there's some abstraction, this is much more detailed than the previous piece. And with Van Gogh's painting, things are abstracted and also quite simplified with really nice long outlines. And Matisse has outlines, but things are not only abstracted, but they're also distorted. Whereas this watercolor painting was actually meant to be more of an accurate painting. So when we're looking at these different paint styles and thinking about how would I recreate them, we have to look at those brushstroke properties. We have to look at how accurate is the resulting painting. You also need to pay attention to the kinds of colors that are used. Now, in most of the examples that we have here, there's a pretty wide range of colors, But as I mentioned, Monet is notorious for not using the color black. And so if we were trying to create an algorithm to mimic Monet's painting style, then we probably would want to make sure that we are not using black as well, and we are replacing black tones with just darker blues and browns and greens and purples. We also note that there's a lot of variation because he's using lots of little strokes of varying color. So instead of having a solid surface to the water, he's actually using many, many different colors, many more than might actually have seen. Pointillism also has a lot of variation in the color, as it does Van Gogh, but Van Gogh tends to use fewer colors. So he has very bright, bold colors, but fewer of them. Whereas Matisse uses almost no colors in comparison. I think we've got 4 colors here. It's a very famous painting, and there's only 4 colors in it. And if we look at how the color is used, it's very, very bright and contrasting color with thick black lines. So we have to look at the color, you have to look at the space, the texture of the paint. Now that's an interesting one, and we're not really going to talk much about texture of paint today because that's a physical simulation detail we're not going to be too worried about. But if you look at the texture of watercolor paint, it has this kind of spreading fluid texture to it. Matisse's painting strokes, you can't really tell they're strokes because there's not much texture to them. But if you look at Van Gogh's, this actually looks like it's a textured painting, like someone has used impasto to build up like actual physical texture on the surface of the canvas. And then, of course, if we're looking at different painterly styles, obviously you have to consider composition as one of them, which is just how is the scene composed from one style as opposed to another. So you can see here that Matisse's composition is quite different from Van Gogh's, which is and Van Gogh's is much more similar to Seurat's than it would be to Matisse. So there's lots of things to consider when trying to figure out what gives a painting style its visual qualities. So just to point out a few details with respect to Seurat's painting in particular, we notice that the brush strokes are small dots. The finer details are abstracted by strokes because we have so many fine dots in jittered colors that some of the finer details like lines on the face or details in the eye are completely abstracted. And the paint texture here is, even though it's done with fine points, the texture of the paint's actually quite smooth. So it's not like built up in a 3D surface out of the canvas. So if we wanted to create an algorithm to recreate one of these styles, then there are certain things that we should consider in that algorithm and certain things that we aren't going to consider. The things that we are going to consider in our painterly rendering algorithm are the stroke length, the size and the orientation of the strokes, because that's something we can mimic. We'll take a look at colors and textures, and to some degree the accuracy of the depiction, so how much we're going to abstract the details on something like a face. But things we are not going to consider in our algorithm are things like composition and space, because these are properties of the original image. And the idea behind painterly rendering is we are taking either a 3D scene, 3D geometry, or a photograph, and we are going to run some algorithm on it that makes it look like a painting. So we are going to assume that the composition of the original scene is maintained through this algorithm. Although certainly there are techniques out there where they have tried to adjust the composition to be more fitting to the particular style. Those are fairly recent, so we're not going to worry about that right now. So as I have suggested, we want to be applying this painterly rendering not only to images but also to 3D scenes, because wouldn't you like to be walking around in a painted video game? That could be cool. It seems to me there was one and it was like a wolf. I don't remember the name of it. It's pretty old. So in order to do this, there's actually lots of different approaches we can take to painterly rendering. And you could kind of divide them really into two major classifications. There's those painterly rendering algorithms which aim to create strokes, like actually create strokes as if there was a paintbrush that was digitally painting them onto either the models or onto a page, an imaginary canvas, if you will. And then there's other algorithms where we are trying to manipulate the scene via some kind of filter, median, Gaussian blur to create the appearance of painting without actually physically doing any strokes. And I can tell you from personal experience that the stroke-based algorithms are much, much slower than the filter-based methods, simply because filters are fast mathematical operations, whereas painting strokes, you actually have to figure out, as we are going to see today, where does the stroke have to start, where does the stroke have to travel, what color should it be, and then you have to render it and repeat this process until the whole painting is done. And as you can imagine, a painting could be comprised of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of individual strokes. So we're going to start off looking at various techniques today with painting from a 3D scene. Now that could be turning a 3D scene into a painting, or actually creating shaders or techniques to shade the geometry itself. And I want to tell you in advance that we're only presenting a few algorithms for painterly rendering here today. I want you to know that there are many, many others out there. I've chosen ones that I want to say are probably the most well-known. And they are a little bit older. There are certainly newer techniques that exist, and we'll look at some newer techniques for painterly in the next lecture. But today we're going to stick with kind of the classics, because sometimes the classics work really, really well. So if we think back to all those paintings that we were looking at, you might have noticed that a lot of painterly styles, so a lot of different painting styles, aside from, you know, like this really old Renaissance paintings, tend to have pretty blurred or distorted recreations of the objects in the scene. So for example, you don't see a lot of smooth and crisp edges. The strokes, instead of painting the exact stroke, it'll be, you know, a few strokes here and a few strokes there and a few strokes over here. So there's a roughness to the appearance. And generally speaking, when we're talking about painterly, or when most people are thinking of painterly, that's what they're thinking of, as more of an impressionist or expressionist style painting. So you can actually very quickly create a rough appearance using a simple shader in a rendering tool of your choice. And the idea is that you want to take whatever surface you have and increase the number of vertices. Because what you're going to do next is you're going to apply a point or vertex jitter to each of the points of your model. Now, what does it mean to jitter your points? What that means is that we're going to compute some random small XYZ value, and we're going to add a different random XYZ value to each of the vertex in the model to move it from its current position just a little bit. Maybe it'll go in, maybe it'll go out, maybe it'll go this way, maybe it'll go that way. We are jittering. We're making it noisy. And then if we take this jittered object and then apply a toon shader to quantize or limit our color palette, we can actually get almost a rough painted approach. So to give you an example of how to do this, we can do it in Houdini, and I'll actually bring Houdini up to do this in a minute. I have applied a point jitter to it, and you can see here now that and a toon shader, and you can see that the vertices have actually been manipulated in such a way that my smooth torus now looks like a bumpy one, and at a distance, you know, it kind of does look a little bit painted because it's got that rough qualities that we would expect. So this is it again, just a different toon shader. But it's one of the issues with this particular method for doing it is that because you've actually physically altered the geometry, the outlines of this geometry are very harsh, and it's obvious that you actually just manipulated the geometry. And if you look at paintings, the strokes aren't perfectly opaque either. There's a certain amount of transparency to them and blending. So we're not getting that from this technique. So there's a little tiny change that we can make to give it more of a painted quality, and it's really simple. So all you have to do is render the scene several times with different random number seeds so that the jittered vertices are going to be in different positions each time you render it. You might actually want to animate it, so make that a keyframe so that the seed value changes. And then when you take each of those frames and composite them together with an alpha value, you will get that bit of transparency. It will cut down on that opacity. And that's the result you would get by doing that. So this was actually created by using seed 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then compositing those images together with a 50% opacity. And as you can see now, we get an added bit of roughness, but our outline is also less crisp, so it looks a bit more rough and painted. It's simulating the paint style a bit better. Now, the advantage of the previous method where we just jittered the points and then rendered it straight up and did none of this extra rendering and compositing step is that this can actually be easily animated. You can stick a light in there and some keyframes and you just go. Whereas if you wanted to create an animated painting using this technique here, you'd actually have to create some number of different copies of your animation scene, each one with different random jitters being applied to each of the objects in your scene. So it's not that it can't be done, it's just that it's not something that you could do in real time. This requires offline processing. The other downside is that if you have models which have a lot of triangles to start with, it doesn't look so good. So I took the same technique from before, applying a small jitter to the vertices of the meshes. And the horse mesh here has significantly fewer triangles than the dragon mesh. And the horse mesh doesn't look too bad, but the dragon mesh looks awful. And it's just because there were so many tiny triangles that when we applied the jitter, we almost completely changed what this object was. If we then render this out 5 times using different amounts of random jitter and composite those images together, you can see we've softened the appearance somewhat because we have that opacity being added in there. And actually the horse looks pretty good now, but the dragon still looks really awful. And the dragon looks really awful because when we applied the jitter to those really tiny triangles, we were fundamentally changing the model. The triangles are now pointing completely random directions. The mesh doesn't make any sense anymore. So this method works really easy. It's super, super easy to achieve. Should really only take you a few minutes to do. Unfortunately, you know, you don't get the brush strokes. You get the appearance of brush strokes, but there's no actual physical strokes that I could look at. So you're not getting a lot of texture opportunities. The other thing is it's really dependent on what kinds of models you are using in your scene. If they're high triangle, heavily subdivided, then it's not going to look so good. So just to show you really quick how easy it is to put this together. So we've got Houdini open here. Let's make it so you can actually see the whole thing. And we'll drop in a torus. So why not? Everybody likes toruses, right? So what you're going to do in Houdini is you double click on the geometry object, and then you're going to add a point jitter node. Point jitter. And you're going to connect the output of the torus geometry to the input of the point jitter. Now you'll notice when we do that by default that it creates this really, really crazy wireframe. And that's because we're not actually observing the results of applying the point jitter to the geometry. So you see how this blue observation or node is blue? We actually want to move that to the point jitter. And then we get that. And that's crazy. It's actually really cool looking. But that's a bit more jitter than I think we wanted. So if you look up above here in this part of the menu, there's a scale. And so we can set that. 0.01 was not enough, so let's 0.1. Now, this doesn't have a lot of quadrilaterals making up this torus, which means that we're not getting as much variation. So clicking back on the torus node, and if you go to details, oh, sorry, I guess we're clicking on the wrong thing. Just click on torus. At the very bottom, you'll see rows and columns. See that there? So if we change that to, like, I don't know, let's do 50 rows and 100 columns. You can see here how we have made some pretty drastic changes. Now, this is also pointing out the dangers of having too many small triangles, because now I have a lot more triangles, and the amount of variation that I've created in the surface is going to make it so this doesn't render very nicely. So if you are increasing the number of triangles, that means you're, decreasing their size. So when you're going to want to click back on the point jitter, and you're going to want to scale down the jitter. So I think 0.5 is still too much, so let's do 2.5. That's not bad. And let's add a light to our scene. And then the last bit, of course, was to add our toon shader, which, as many of you know, Houdini actually has one built in. Let's grab that. It's just the default colors. There we go. A sort of painted look torus. And all we would have to do is you could animate that seed, or you could set it up so that the jitter varies according to time, and render those images all out to file, and then composite them together with opacity. Set to not 1. And there you go. That is how you do very, very quick and very easy painterly rendering without strokes. But what if I wanted to have strokes? Well, if you want to have strokes, then the previous method isn't your way to go. We're going to need to do something else. So how do you actually put strokes on geometry? Like, I actually want the strokes to be on the geometry such that if I move a light around, the lighting of the strokes changes. Or if I rotate the model, I actually want the strokes to rotate with the model. So there are many, many algorithms to actually do this. And I want to talk about one from 1996, and this was actually out of Disney Research by Barbara Meyer. And this method was designed to do actually animated stroke-based rendering. So rendering a 3D scene animation, and the paint strokes should actually stick to the objects such that when they move, the strokes move with them. And the basic idea of this algorithm is that you're going to distribute a bunch of particles or points across the 3D objects. And there's a variety of different ways that you could do that. You could obviously just do the vertices. The problem with using just the vertices is that actually creates a regular pattern, which may be unpleasant to view. So you could do a jittered set of vertices, for example. Regardless, there are many different ways you can distribute particles along the surface of a 3D object. And then once you've done that, what you want to do is sort the points from back to front, because if you were to sit down and paint, you're going to paint the specks. There are some strokes you're going to paint, and then you're going to paint strokes over top of them. So this method thought the best way to achieve that layered painted approach is things that are in the far background, you should be painting those first, and then things that are in the foreground, they should get painted last. So we're going to paint from the back to the front, which makes perfect sense. And then what you do for this method after you've sorted the points is you render strokes for each of the points that you put onto the surface of the geometry. And the stroke size, orientation, like how is it sticking like this? Is it sticking like this? So if I had, of course I'm going to drop everything on my desk. Hey, a mouse, let's use this again. So I might want to render the stroke to sit flush on the surface of the mouse. Or maybe I want it to be sticking out from the mouse. It'd be a little weird, but you could do that technically. So you're going to get the orientation, the length of the stroke, the positioning of the stroke. That's going to come from the 3D scene information, which luckily, since you're in a 3D rendering world, you have all that information. The lighting and the color are also going to come from the 3D scene. That way, your stroke color will be influenced by where your actual physical lights are. And then you render the strokes in order from back to front. And since the strokes are fixed to these points, if you animate the scene now, the strokes move with the object. And so you don't get this temporal incoherence effect that we'll talk about a little later. So some images that I've borrowed from Meyer's paper. So she was trying to recreate the haystacks, which is another famous Monet painting. It's a pretty good job, actually. There was 3D models that were here. And it looks like a plane with a texture on it, and another plane, and then some simple haystack models. And some points have been distributed around this model. And then some strokes have been created such that they lie flush with the surface. So you can see they're going down the faces of the cone. And then when you actually do the rendering, it starts by rendering the back colors first, because they're further back. And then you start rendering moving forward until the last bits are rendered. Now what's interesting here is she's actually rendered things not according to the viewer, but according to the light, which is an interesting technique. And it actually makes a lot of sense, because we're not going to paint these dark tones in the middle, even though they're on the Z buffer closest to us. We're not going to paint them last. We typically paint lighter colors over darker colors. And here's some other examples of results from her paper. You can see the 3D models with different kinds of strokes. These ones are more circular strokes with opacity and harsher edges to create a watercolored look. And then here's where you varied the colors and the orientation of the strokes to give impressionism and other various interesting effects. So that's pretty cool. Now there are some more modern methods where you can actually have the strokes go around. So instead of just flat little strokes, you can have curved strokes that actually curve with the model. And one of the downsides of these techniques typically tends to be that the strokes end up looking like you've wrapped the models with some wrapping paper. And that's not the goal of this method. The goal of painterly rendering, we actually want the strokes to, make a rough appearance. And if the strokes are like wrapping paper, then you get the sharp edges. So there are much newer techniques which give you rougher and curved strokes as well. But you don't tend to see a lot of painterly rendering happening in 3D space, which you generally, when we're thinking about painterly rendering, we're often thinking about it being applied to 2D images. And as it turns out, there's a lot of interesting things that you can do to try to create a painted look, and we've seen it before, but just to show you again, we can use things like Gaussian blur, median filters, box blurs, edge detection, canny, and so on, to create a somewhat painted look. So I've done that with this tiger image. I applied a pretty large median filter. I think it was radius 15. And then I computed the edges of the tiger and I multiplied the median filtered image by the edges to kind of give it an almost watercolored appearance. And this takes, it's instant. It's really, really fast to do, which is nice. But if you look at Photoshop itself, and I'm sorry, I don't have Photoshop on this computer. This is a Linux machine. I think Photoshop runs on Linux. I'm not 100% sure on that. Huh. Never tried. But if you look in Photoshop, in the filter gallery, they have a whole pile of different painterly styles. They tend to be labeled under strokes and styles. So this particular one is paint dabs. It looks like a bunch of little dabs of paint. It's very, very fine, but it kind of looks maybe like a tempera painting. This one here is angled strokes, again from the Photoshop's filter gallery, and it's using strokes on angles like this and like this to give it a painted look. And I had to crank the parameters up pretty high to make it look this painted. It's not really rendering strokes, it's just distorting the colors that are there using various techniques. And this one is probably one of the more visible ones. This is, again, from Photoshop's filter gallery. This creates the appearance of a Sumier painting, which tends to have a lot of the black or darker colors, really strong, which looks pretty cool. This is one of my more favorite filters. And then if you did actually want to have something with strokes, you can. There's one that's called pointillism. And pointillism will actually render your scene with a bunch of dots. Now, unlike our stipple generator from the previous lecture, these points are not evenly distributed, but I have jittered the color a little bit to give it sort of the appearance of a Seurat painting. But as you can see, there's actually a lot of space between here, and Seurat's painting doesn't have that kind of spacing between. Regardless, lots of options. But I'm not happy with any of these. Because what I want is to actually see some nice long curved brush strokes like I might see in a Van Gogh painting. And none of the techniques, even the 3D techniques we've talked about, are capable of doing that. They're not going to give you long curved strokes that follow the surfaces, that follow the edges. So we want to come up with an algorithm that creates long, curved, strokes while still exhibiting a painterly appearance. And it would be really nice if it had that progressive refinement where you start with a big brush and you paint your scene, and then you get a smaller brush and you put in finer details, and you get an even smaller brush and you put even finer details. Yet that kind of progressive refinement is absent from everything we've talked about so far. In order to do this, there's a lot of things that we actually need. For example, we need to know what direction the strokes should be traveling in, and where should we even place the strokes? How long should the strokes be? There's so much more information we need in order to create a stroke-based painterly algorithm. So here's the very high-level algorithm, and then we're going to dive into each of these individual components to discuss how these all work. I should probably jump ahead and show you a nice picture. I don't have any nice pictures in here. Let's see. Let me grab a nice picture so you know what we're aiming for. Go into my drive. That's videos. This is one of those. I didn't copy it to the directory, so I don't really have any examples. But what I can do is drop one in. Well, you know what? We'll skip this for now. Imagine it in your head. So here's our high-level algorithm. We're going to start with a whole pile of different brushes, because if we were to sit down to paint, we tend to use a bunch of different brushes of different sizes. And for each brush size, so for each different paintbrush, we're going to paint the scene for all of the content that we need with that brush size. So until all of the strokes for that brush are done, we're going to find a place on our painting where we need a brush stroke with this particular brush, and we're going to paint it. So we're looking at our scene. Oh, I need some fan brush over here. Okay, I'll paint some fan brush. Oh, I need some fan brush over here. Okay, there's no more places where I need a fan brush. Let's switch down to a nice small round with a 00. Or a lovely dagger brush, and we'll just paint with those. So progressive refinement, starting from the largest brush, working our way towards the smallest brush so that the salient details are at the foreground. The first problem we need to solve is, where do you put the strokes? So we know for this algorithm, you're going to be given an image, some kind of photograph. And I need to know, where do I start placing strokes? We create a canvas. Now the canvas can have an initial color. It doesn't have to have any initial color. It could all be set to max error. Or it could be set to white or some other color, canvas color. And the idea is that we want to place strokes where the new strokes, where the existing paint strokes aren't enough to depict the level of detail that we desire. But how do you know if an area needs more detail? How do you know it doesn't have enough detail, enough strokes? Well, we're going to use a computation of the error. So we have two images. We have the input photograph and we have our digital canvas, the painting so far. And we're going to subdivide the painting so far into these brush-sized regions. I'm going to just bring up this. So if this is our canvas, then we're going to divide it into little blocks like this. So into little blocks, and this would assume that our paintbrush looked like this. It's a really weird fan brush. I like fan brushes. So after we've got our our virtual painting divided into these little regions, we're doing the same thing to our input image as well. And what we're going to do is for each of those little squares, I want to know what is the difference in this square of the painting versus the square of the input image. How different are these two regions? If we haven't painted anything into this region yet, then it's maximally different because there's no paint. But if we've been painting layer upon layer of strokes, then I would anticipate that the difference between the painting and the image is significantly less. And what we're going to do is we compute the difference, the average difference, because it's multiple pixels wide and multiple pixels tall, it's an area. And we're going to compute the average difference between the painted region and the input image. We need a new stroke in that area if the error is greater than some threshold. It means greater than some value. So if the difference is greater than the threshold, that means we add a stroke. And if it's less than the threshold, then we don't add a stroke because the current amount of paint in that region is sufficient for this brush size. So we don't need any refinement there. How do you compute the difference? So how do you compute the difference? We know how to do an average. You sum up all the values and then divide it by the total number of values. But how do you compute the difference between the input image pixel and the painted pixels? Well, what you're going to do is the Euclidean distance, except instead of using X, Y, Z, you're going to use RGB, the colors, to compute the distance. So we're going to actually use, so we've got color from the painting so far is P, and the color from the image, input image, is C. So we're just going to compute the Euclidean distance. That's all, which is the square root of the sum of square differences. That's it. And you compare this result to the threshold. If it's less than the threshold, then we don't need a stroke. And if it's greater than or equal to the threshold, then we do want a stroke. So now that you've identified this block needs a new paint stroke because it doesn't have enough detail, how do you know where in this paint block to start the stroke? Well, there's lots of different techniques that you could use to choose the starting point and starting color of the stroke. One, random. You could just choose a random spot and choose a random color from the region. Probably doesn't work that bad, actually. You could put it in the center. The problem with putting it in the center is that it's going to create a very regular looking painting. That is, the strokes will be very obviously separated by the same amount. Or instead, you could find out which pixel actually has the greatest amount of error between the current painting and the actual input image, and choose that to be the starting point for your stroke and set the color to be the color of that pixel. And it makes sense because that, pixel would represent the biggest error, the place that needs the most refinement, and choosing the color from that would mean that we are trying to address that directly. So we've identified the ability to determine whether we need a stroke and where the stroke is going to go. But what we haven't actually talked about is how do you decide what direction the stroke goes? I mean, a human could do it. They're like, oh yeah, it's a face. I'm just going to paint like this along the face, paint here, paint here, paint here. We know what direction to paint our strokes in, but a computer doesn't, because a computer doesn't know it's painting. Computer doesn't know what a painting is. So we need something, some clue from the image to try to figure out what direction should this stroke be going in. And what we're going to do is use something known as the image gradient, the gradient field. What's that? Real simple idea. The image gradient is just keeping track of the change in the pixel intensity or color as we move along the X or Y axis. So if you look at this image, we're moving along the x-axis, so left to right, and we can see that moving left to right in the top row, the intensity, that is the apparent brightness of the pixel, is decreasing, which means that the gradient is decreasing. Now in the second row, the intensity increases, and so too does the image gradient. What the image gradient is actually is the derivative with respect to x and y of the image. That's all it is. So what that means is that the image gradient for every pixel has two components. We have the change in x and something that describes the change in y. So we know for a given pixel, what we end up having computed is the direction of maximum change. We have an xy, which means we have a direction vector. We now have the direction of maximum change. Now, how do you get the image gradient? Well, as it turns out, there are many different ways that we can either compute it or estimate it. We can use the Sobel filter. We can use the Pruitt filter. I think you can even use the Roberts-Krauss filter. There's forward differencing, central differencing, backward differencing. There's a whole pile of different techniques. And some of these we've talked about before, like Sobel and Pruitt. You know, I'd be like, aren't those for edge detection? Yes. Actually, they are for computing the gradient, and the edge detection is a threshold that we've applied to it. But yes, we did use them for edge detection, and they can be used again here. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about the differencing techniques. So if you didn't have access to a Sobel filter, could you actually compute the image gradient yourself? And the answer is yes. It's very, very easy to do in an image. So forward differencing it looks like I made a typo here. This should say central differencing, not forward differencing. My apologies. So central differencing is the one I want to talk about. The idea of central differencing is I want to know for the what is the change between the pixel on my left and the pixel on my right? What is the change, the average amount of change I am expecting to see between those two pixels? So, or up and down. So we have a different formula for central differencing depending on your axis. So if you're going along x, we're going to look at the difference between c of x plus 1 and c of x minus 1. And then if we're going along y, we're doing cy plus 1 and cy minus 1. But the formula is the same. You're just changing which axis you're applying it to. So you take the pixel above you and the pixel below you, you subtract them, their intensities or colors from each other, and then you divide it by 2, which is the distance between them. And since you have 2 points, you could also consider it the average. And when you do that, you get a somewhat smoothed computation of the change. Now, the smoothing part's actually kind of important because if you do this without any smoothing, then your strokes end up moving very erratically due to noise in the image, because of compression, artifacts, and so on. So from this diagram here, the central difference along the x-axis, looking at position c, x, y, we are going to take c of x plus 1, and we subtract c of y plus 1, and that's going, that gives us a value of 1, and we divide that by 2, so we get the central difference along x is 0.5. Now forward differencing, we just look to our right or to our up. Backward differencing, we look to our left or down. And we are not skipping over one, we are actually looking at our immediate neighbor. So forward differencing is c of x plus 1 minus c of x. Backwards differencing is c of x minus c of x minus 1. Now, this is faster. because we're not dividing anything. But it's a little bit more sensitive to noise, so artifacting, compression loss, and so on. Something to keep in mind. So now that you've actually you've seen we can compute the image gradient very, very easily. It's super easy to do. What is it really telling us? Well, it's telling us the direction where the biggest change in color or intensity is happening in. So, for example, random object off my desk, a lovely Mars eraser, my favorite. So we've got blue and white, and if I was taking the differencing going this way along X, it would tell me that the biggest change is actually this direction. Whereas if I go up, there's no change. So what this is doing is it's telling us the direction of the biggest change in intensity or color. But that's not really what we wanted to do, because if the image gradient tells us the direction where the biggest change is, i.e. crossing the boundary from the blue surface onto the white, that's not how paint behaves. I don't suddenly, I'm painting my paintbrush. I don't have any paintbrushes on my desk, but I've got forks, and we can pretend a fork is one. So I'm painting. My paintbrush doesn't start magically turning from white paint to blue paint the second I cross the edge. We'll do white, wash the brush off, blue, but those are disjoint, unconnected strokes. They cross edges. They cross the boundaries of the objects themselves. What we want to do is paint along the object with the same color. If I am painting with a pink brush, I want to paint all of the pink. So we don't want to follow the direction that the gradient tells us. We actually want to follow the perpendicular to it. That is, the direction that is 90 degrees to it, because that will be the direction of least change, which means it's still this object and it's still this color. So that would let us follow the comb. Now, how do you know if a direction is perpendicular to something? Well, if you take the gradient at the point and what you think is the perpendicular, and you do the dot product of them, if it's 0, then those two vectors are perpendicular. So what we're going to do to direct our strokes is not follow the image gradient directly, but follow the perpendicular of it. And it's very easy to get the perpendicular. You flip, because it's 2 dimensions, you flip X and Y and negate one of them. Done. Super easy. And you think of it this way. If my stroke is going in this direction, the perpendicular is going in that direction. And technically that direction as well. Pretty cool. So our strokes are going to follow the perpendiculars of the gradient field, which is very easily computed. But how do we know where to put the next point? So our strokes, in order to get long curves, we're going to render them as B-splines or Bezier splines or some kind of long curve, which means that it's going to be specified by some number of control points. How far apart do we put them? Do we just put them at the very next pixel? Like pixel by pixel? Okay, this place. You could do that, but it actually tends to be very susceptible to noise in the image, and we don't want that. So instead, the points are going to be at least the brushstroke radius apart. So we compute the next point of the stroke as the current point of the stroke plus r, which is the radius, times the stroke direction. Very similar to computing the surface points of an object when working with a ray tracer. You're going to continue the strokes, so when you get to the next point, you ask about the difference in the color of the paint you're using and the color of the original image, and if they're too different, you're going to terminate the stroke, because I don't want pink strokes from this fork carrying over into my dress, which is kind of a slate blue and black. They're not similar colors. They shouldn't overlap each other. So if we put this all together now, we have a brush size, a set of brush sizes, and for each region, we're going to compute the error between the region painting and the region photograph. If that error is greater than some tolerance, we need a stroke. The stroke is going to start at the pixel that has the biggest error, and it's going to be the color of that pixel. Then we are going to use the image gradient to figure out what direction the stroke could go. So we'll take the perpendicular of it. And so then we're going to create the next point. And then we'll ask, is this point's color close enough to the paint color or not? If it is too far away, then we're going to terminate the stroke. Otherwise, we repeat the process. The stroke now goes to that point, we compute the next point for the stroke, and then we repeat until we've reached the maximum length the stroke is allowed to be, or the stroke is traveling into lands that are a different color completely. And then now that we've got all the strokes for each layer, we slap them onto the canvas using a draw operation. And then you repeat step one, the initial step one, with a different brush stroke. Now, one of the things you have to pay a lot of attention to with this particular algorithm is that it's very susceptible to noise, not just in the computation of the gradient field. And so one of the things that you can do to help with the noise is to run a denoising algorithm prior to actually running this. I typically tend to use Gaussian blur, but you do not have to do it at all. If you wanted to do a different kind of blur, box blur, media, go right ahead. It can be any kind of blur. And then when we run the algorithm, this is what we get. So this is a photo that's been painted, and you can see here there are actual physical long brush strokes, and those strokes are following the curvature of the objects in the scene. They're tracing them. Now there's some mess where they come unglued and they're not closely following what they're supposed to be, but this is probably because stroke length was set really, really long, and the tolerance is quite low, which means that strokes can travel far from home. And here's another example with shorter strokes that looks a little bit better. And here's another one still. These are actual physical strokes. Now, one thing you will note about the strokes as I've rendered them is that they're really just solid, untextured paint. If you look at many painterly rendering algorithms that you'll find online, you'll note that they've actually applied a paint stroke texture to them to make them look more realistic. This is not an explicit part of the algorithm, but it certainly can it's an easy post thing that you can do to make it look a little bit more realistic. That's nice. Those are kind of boring paintings though. Now, the other thing we have to keep in mind is this painterly rendering algorithm, which is actually by Aaron Hertzman from 1998, is that there's a lot of different parameters that we can control. For example, we can control the tolerance or threshold we use to decide whether we're allowed to place a stroke here or not. Tolerance is also used to decide when to terminate a stroke, because if the next point of the stroke falls in an area where the paint color is way too far away from the color of the underlying image, probably don't want to be painting there. So tolerance impacts the stroke length, but also where the strokes are going to be initially placed. Large tolerances, strokes can get very crazy, and small tolerances, your strokes will actually stick to the salient details very tightly. So they'll be very, very small. Now, stroke length. You can actually specify a minimum and maximum length if you choose. If you set the minimum to something very small and the maximum to something very big, then you're going to get strokes of all different size ranges. Whatever is most appropriate in that position will be used. What a minimum stroke length means is that, tolerance aside, this is the minimum stroke length that we will permit a stroke to be. If we wanted to create some really long fluid strokes, we can set the tolerance to a little bit higher value and increase the minimum and maximum stroke length. And then when you render it, this is a potential result. And this is one of my favorites that I did quite a few years ago. And what I like about this is how you get swirling going on inside of the center of the rose. These really loud, wild, fluid strokes. They're really fun. And this one's even more fun. So in this one, we've cranked the tolerance way high so that it's encouraging longer strokes and less levels of refinement. And then we've set the minimum and maximum stroke length to be really long to ensure that we're getting the creation of long strokes. And this creates a somewhat abstract version of these tulips, but I think it's really cool. Now, what other kinds of parameters can we play with? Oh, there's so many different kinds of parameters. We could play around with the canvas that we are painting on. The algorithm, as it is initially stated, has a canvas that has an error value. That is, you can't compute the distance between the image and the canvas because it's the maximum distance. Now, that would ensure that strokes cover the whole page. And that's actually one of the big things with a lot of these stroke-based algorithms, is how do you guarantee that the strokes actually cover the whole page? Kind of important. Van Gogh just didn't put, one stroke over here and one stroke over here and then abandon the rest of the canvas. He filled the canvas. So we don't have to use that kind of canvas, though. We don't have to use a canvas that is the max error to start with. You could actually use a color canvas. So a white one, or a black one, or a purple one, or a green one, or an orange one. You can use any color canvas you want. This makes life really interesting because what you're going to get is if there's any region of the image that's really similar in color to your canvas color, you're not getting any paint strokes there because they're not going to meet that threshold. Now, it might sound counterintuitive, like, why would I care? That doesn't sound like what I want, because it's not what a painting is. But actually, you can get some cool results out of it. So this is one where we painted a rose onto a black canvas. And the tolerance was set very, very high. And what's neat about this, there's a few neat things going on. So number one, we've actually made sure that the blocks where the strokes will be placed are actually really far spaced apart so that we get some spacing in between the individual strokes. We also, by setting the tolerance really high, anything that was even remotely near black would get rendered as black. But since black paint and a black canvas are the same color, you're going to end up with large regions with just no strokes. And I thought this was one of the more fun results. And here's some more. And you'll notice that these are all rendered with just dots. You're not restricted to using this technique just with dot strokes. This is where you've set the max and min length of the stroke to 0. But I've used that in these examples because I think they're so cool looking. So we've done that with the tiger with a higher threshold. And then this is a slot canyon, and we've done it again, and I think it creates a pretty stunning image. Now this one here, this water scene here, this is actually starting to look pretty cool. And in some ways, this would look like a Monet painting if it wasn't for all the black. If we change this to dark greens, browns, blues, and purples, it would look a lot more like a Monet painting. But what we've done here is now we have more than point strokes. They are short strokes, but they're, you know, maybe 5 or 10 units long. And it's created a neat effect here. Now, aside from testing the thresholds, the canvas, the lengths of the strokes, you can also tell the algorithm to jitter the color of the strokes. And again, what jitter means is just adding some small random value. Now, the reason why we might want to jitter the colors is if you look at something like Van Gogh's Starry Night, or you look at Seurat's pointillist works, there's a lot of jitter in the color. It's not just, you know, a solid pink for the fork. There might be some pink and some peach and some yellow and some other colors. We want to use a bunch of colors to render the fork. So what we can do is apply a jitter. And this is a fun result that you might get. It's actually the same rows as before, but this time we've rendered it with really long strokes that have been jittered with their color. And I'm really happy with the results of this one. Now, you could even, in some ways, instead of just jittering the colors, you could quantize them, create a palette of colors that you are permitted to use. And then when you go to paint each stroke, you ask, okay, this is the color I'm supposed to paint in because it's the color from the image. Which of the palette colors is it closest to? And then you paint with the palette color. So this was an image I rendered doing just that technology, that idea, and I thought it created a very interesting result. And this one was done similarly with very limited paint palettes. I think there's actually 6 colors, I think, in this image. But I was really happy with this result as well. The point I'm trying to tell you is that stroke-based painterly rendering algorithm, because it has so many different parameters, you can achieve many, many, many different looks. I was really hoping to actually give you this code to play with on your own for assignment 5, but unfortunately, getting image magic to work can be just a little bit too much. You'll spend 2 weeks trying to get that library to work instead of actually playing around with the code and having fun. So we're not getting that. What? Now there's something funny going on here. If you were to paint like this method paints, you would be taking your paintbrush, dipping it in one color, painting one stroke in red, washing the brush out, getting a bit of blue paint, painting one stroke of blue, washing the brush out, getting a bit of green paint, painting one stroke of green, and then washing the brush out. That is so inefficient. Nobody does that. You get some paint of red on your brush, you paint the red, you paint the red. You get some more red paint on the brush. You paint more red, you paint more red. We tend to paint in 1 or 2 colors at a time. And this algorithm is not doing that. Now you might be like, doesn't matter. Well, it's going to matter in the terms of not all oil paints are actually transparent. Some of them are translucent. And, you know, there are, in a lot of ways, darker colors do tend to be painted first. So if we wanted to recreate how the artist actually lays the strokes down on the real canvas, what would we have to do? Well, one of the easy ways that we could try to solve this is by storing all of the strokes up. Don't paint them onto the canvas. or don't paint the final strokes onto the canvas, because you might want to keep a copy of your strokes and then render them differently later. So you have all the strokes, collect them all up for each brush stroke size. Paint them to the canvas in order by luminance. So starting with the darkest color, I'm moving towards the lightest color. And what you're doing when you do that is you're guaranteeing that you're doing all the dark ones first, and then all the medium tones, and then finally the highlight tones on top. And it does actually create a unique appearance. And this is it. So this image here was rendering the light colors first and the dark colors last. And this one here was rendering the dark colors first and the light colors last. And you can see here that the styles of the two paintings are drastically different, just based on the order that you were painting the brush strokes in. So that's an important thing to keep track of whenever you're doing a painterly rendering algorithm, is what order should you be painting these strokes out in? Now, obviously, how an artist paints these lines is far more sophisticated than what we're doing, but this was a simple approximation. And it gives us lots of cool results. All right. I want to go back and talk about gesture drawing, rough sketches. We've already talked about contours and lines and hatching, but there was one technique that I told you we couldn't quite talk about because we didn't have the tools. We have the tools now to talk about how to do this final technique for contours and hatching. And that's to create these gesture drawings. And the tool we want to use is actually the painterly rendering algorithm we just introduced. So we notice from our images, these rough sketches here, that, there's a lot of roughness, a lot of overdrawn appearance. We have the contours, but they're super loose, and sometimes there's some hatching or shading or just general scribbling. But looking at our techniques from previously, while things like Canny and Sobel find edges, they don't guarantee they find them all, and when they do find them, they render them very precisely. Now you could afterwards manipulate it so that it's not as smooth and crisp, but it doesn't give you the big fluid lines like you see in these images here. If I want to create a drawing like this, well, wait a minute, isn't that what that is? Isn't that what that is? I have literally one drop. So it's very clear that our painterly algorithm is capable of drawing these really long, curvy, fluid strokes. But it puts paint down, not ink lines. And, well, actually, with a really small modification to the paint algorithm we just discussed, we can make it produce these sketches, these gesture drawings. And it's very, very simple what you have to do. You still produce the painting. Keep track of all of the stroke points. When we're choosing to draw our stroke, we're not choosing every single pixel and actually, computing the whole thing. We're choosing the control points for the curve to be drawn through by the computer. Okay? Is this, all these lines that I love in these paintings here, I could sketch this, couldn't I, if I just kept the spine that is the center of each of these paint strokes? Yeah, that's exactly what we want. So what we're going to do, jumping ahead too many slides there, is we paint the picture and we keep all the strokes, keep all the this control points. And then when we're done with the painting, because the painting's going to specify where the strokes are going, where the refinement needs to go, which is typically near edges and salient details, so we'll get lots of overdrawn appearance there. We take all of the strokes and we render them, instead of as thick paint strokes, as single pixel wide black lines. And if you do that, you turn this painting into this sketch. which looks a lot more fluid and loose than our previous ones. It's messy, and it's cool looking at the same time. And I've shown you several others before, but we're just going to keep it to my favorite one for now. All right. So that's how you do these sketches, is you're just making a tiny modification to the paint algorithm. What if I wanted to do hatching, some shading? Actually, we can still do it. And in fact, we can modify this paint algorithm one more time to give us the hatching. Here's the thing. There's a big difference. Hatches only appear in the dark areas. We don't put hatches in light areas. We put hatches in shadows. So like under someone's chin or under their eyes if they're really tired, like I obviously am. That's where you put the hatches. Dark areas. So we only want to do this painting where the luminance or apparent brightness is less than some thresholds, which we would parameterize. So that's part one. Part two, change. Stroke direction. Our edges follow the contours of the objects in the scene. They follow the edges. I know it's really messy, but believe me, these strokes, for the most part, are following the contours of the rows. Hatches do not follow the contours. Hatches typically follow the surface curvature, so the actual 3D shape. They go perpendicular to the contours. But wait! Our strokes were perpendicular to the image gradient. So our hatches will just directly follow the image gradient. And be a lot shorter. That's the other thing we have to keep in mind. The hatches will be a lot shorter. And you can still do progressive refinement because obviously we want to have layers of hatching. So there's dark, 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 medium dark, brighter dark. So you can actually do this paint, render the strokes for each layer, and then composite them all up to get different darknesses produced by the levels of hatching. So this is the hatching that we produced for this photo here, which is actually at Buckingham Palace. And then we can take this super rough gesture drawing and composite the hatches in. So now we have this rough gesture drawing that actually has some shading to help us depict what this surface actually is. I think it's pretty cool. And here's the hatches that we generated for the tiger. And again, you can see here that the hatches, they're not following the curve, like the black or the white. They're actually following now the direction of greatest change. What I really like about this one is it actually looks like we drew the fur of the tiger. I think that looks pretty cool. I didn't know that was going to happen. And then this is the one we did for the rose. This is just one of the layers of sketching because remember, we've got multiple paintbrush sizes, each one producing strokes. You don't have to use all 3 or 5 or 1. You can use a subset of the strokes from the layers. So this is just using one layer of strokes and one layer of hatches, and you get this really cool hatched rose here. So it's really cool how you can take one algorithm and it's got all these different parameters and it can do so many different styles, and then with just a tiny little modification you can produce something completely different. It's really fun. And that's one of the really fun and beautiful things about non-photorealistic rendering. You can take a cool algorithm, modify it via parameters, or make just a little tweak to the code and get something completely different. It's really fun. All right. So something I want to talk about now is different uses of painterly rendering. There are many different uses. Image stylization, like Instagram. Those are places where you would typically see things like that. Snapchat, never used it. I'm not a cell phone person. I think the only thing I use my cell phone for is logging into our email and starting my Roomba. We can also see painterly rendering used in some video games. And you also see it used in some films. So, for example, there is a movie called What Dreams May Come, which was released in 1998. It stars Robin Williams. And I don't want to give away too much of the plot. Admittedly, I haven't seen it in like 20 years, but a character enters a rich painted world. And they actually wanted it to be like this character enters a painting. And instead of actually having artists sit there and paint, because this would have been, keep in mind that movies are 24 frames per second, it's 24 images per second. You would not want to actually have an artist, because you want to make sure there's a consistency of style, painting like 100,000 frames. That doesn't make sense. So they wanted a computer to produce these paint strokes. So they actually used a painterly rendering algorithm, a stroke one, to render the strokes for this movie. And it actually brought up a lot of questions and a lot of research around it, is how do we animate the painting? How do we animate painterly rendering? Do you render new strokes for every frame? Or are you going to take the ones you have and move them? What do you do to animate a painting? It's an odd idea. It's actually an ongoing topic of research. So I don't know if you've seen shots from this movie, but here you go. So again, these are actual physical strokes rendered by the computer using some image as a reference. And they did not use the algorithm that I showed you here. They actually used an algorithm that was a little bit older and simpler. But here's another one here. Now they've done one thing on top of this. So on top of just rendering the strokes, you can actually see, now Robin Williams here is actually painted, but the background is computer generated. You can actually see they've textured the strokes by applying, an image texture just to make them look a little bit more paint-like. Whereas if you look at my painterly renders back here, these are all my results, by the way. I have not applied any paint texture to make it look like strokes because I didn't think it was necessary. But I could have. I just didn't want to. So that's cool. But it brings up this interesting question. As we said, how do you animate a painting? How do you animate these non-photorealistic rendering styles? Because if we're trying to create an animation of a photoreal scene, we just throw in some keyframes and animate it like we normally would. We don't have to worry about the rendering of it, because it's just going to look like, an actual glass turning in space. There's nothing unusual about that. But if this was a painting of a glass, how do I animate that? It's very weird. There's this topic of much discussion amongst people in NPR, it's non-photorealistic rendering, called temporal coherence. And the idea behind temporal coherence is, does the current frame follow the previous one, or is it completely different? And the idea is that if your frames are rendered independently of each other, that is, they know nothing about the previous frame or the next frame, then the paint strokes are going to appear to be popping in and out, which the belief is that that noise is going to distract you from being able to depict the objects in the scene. But it's also going to be very distracting. Possibly unpleasant. Or at least that's the theory. So, is there a way that we could actually render our non-photorealistic rendering as a temporally coherent animation? And the answer is yes. Actually, there's lots of techniques out there for doing temporally coherent animations. The weighted Voronoi stippling algorithm we showed you in last class, there is actually a technique for doing that. Effectively, what you would want to do for that is you use the points, the stipple points, for the previous frame as the initial points for the next frame. So the points are going to move around a little bit, but they're still the same points. And you may need to add a few more or remove a few, but, you know, there's a way to do that. But what about our paintings? Well, one of the ways that you could do is you could stick them to the object that they depict. And that means, okay, these are the strokes that are my glasses, and they're going to stay being the strokes to my glasses. I'm going to pin them to this. So when I move to the next frame, I actually need to move that stroke, and I might need to distort it somewhat. And then any regions that are empty, I'm going to have to paint some new strokes. That's actually, I mean, you're going to have to look at optical flow to figure out the motion of things. And it's going to look weird because this stroke that used to, I'm looking for something I can bend. Oh, that doesn't bend. Oh, I guess this does. A wallet. So you've got this thing, here's my stroke, and the one, and then in the next one it's bent like this, and it's like, all of a sudden my paint strokes look like inchworms crawling across the screen. It's really weird. So it is technically a technique that would give us temporal coherence, but it also creates a weird appearance of paint strokes becoming inchworms as they go across the screen. So another one, an observation that was made by Hertzman, who is actually the creator of the painterly rendering algorithm we went over in detail, he made the observation that for most animations, the difference between one frame and the next frame is very, very small. So his idea to create some temporal coherence was to use the previous frame as the initial painting for the next frame. Kind of like with the stippling, you use the original points as the starting points for the next frame. So you're going to have, frame F1 be the paint canvas for frame F2. And then you apply the algorithm over again. And the idea is that you would be laying down new strokes, but only where they were needed, only where there was something different. Now, of course, that's still going to have strokes popping in and out of existence. So the idea was to smooth that by recognizing, okay, a new stroke is going to appear in frame I, so let's phase it in over the 5 frames that came before it and phase it out for the 5 frames that follow it by applying an opacity value to the stroke as well. That changes with time. And if you do that, it actually produces interesting results. I've had a lot of time to think about these algorithms, and I'm not convinced that the techniques that we've used, at least in the methods that we're presenting here, I'm not convinced that these are not adding new distractions that are potentially worse than the ones we had before. I have a reason for this argument. And this is why temporal coherence, by the way, is a subject of much debate. And the debate is, do we actually need it? So the previous, few minutes, I've been making the assumption that we do need it. But the techniques we went to get it were in themselves odd and distracting. And if you actually look at hand-animated features, they're not coherent. They're really not. One of the famous ones that I think, maybe famous, I know it, not necessarily famous in Canada, certainly famous in the UK, is the animated special called The Snowman, which is done with pencil crayon. it's not coherent. The pencil crayon strokes from frame to frame are not always the same. They're often very different, and yet I don't even notice. So if maybe the title doesn't ring a bell, perhaps this image will. And it's kind of this pencil crayon watercolor look, and it's very rough, and it pops. Yeah, it is noisy, but I like it. I'm not bothered by it at all. And if you look at old Disney movies, like go back and watch Snow White, pause it really carefully. You can see the hand-drawn outlines of the objects, and they are not coherent. You're not bothered by it, are you? So this is an area where we still need to do a lot of research. We're not entirely certain, do we need coherence? How much coherence do we need? Is there certain parts of the image that need to be coherent and others that don't matter? There's a lot of research that could be done here in evaluating temporal coherence. And if we do need coherence, what constitutes coherence? Is it okay to have, strokes slowly fade in and out? What do we need to do to make it coherent, if we need to at all? So it's a very, very interesting topic of research. If you're interested in that, we can discuss more on Discord. So with that is the end of painterly rendering. We have one more lecture left. And in our last lecture, we're going to be looking at a smorgasbord of other non-photorealistic rendering algorithms. And one of the main focus algorithms we're going to look at in the last lecture is a wonderful thing called style transfer. You'll notice that all of the algorithms that I've used in this lecture today are actually like from the 90s or early 2000s. And that's because there is one master algorithm, I want to say, that's kind of taken over non-photorealistic rendering, at least from images, and it's the style transfer thing. And so we're going to spend some time in our next lecture talking about the wonders and not so wonders of style transfer. Which, if you're curious to know what technique are they using, they're using convolutional neural networks and other deep learning tools to learn the style of one image and apply it to another. So that's really neat. All right, so that is our next class, which will be the last one. So lots of time now to work on your last assignment and project, and we will see you next week.